One of the terms that we've heard it over and over by Russians time and again. They're talking about denazification and then demilitarization of NATO. Do you think in this plan they're talking about 600,000 soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, troops, and whatever that would be? Who who's gonna pay for that, Jeff? Today, looking at the economy of Ukraine today, if they want a make an army, I don't know. Let's go. Europeans talking about 800,000 soldiers.
Yeah,
Who's gonna
yeah.
pay for that? Does the United Kingdom have that size of army? Does Germany have it?
Yeah,
Who's
look. What the 600,000 figure is what's on the what was on the table, right? In the plan as published. I would expect that to be one of the elements of the plans that the Russians will want to talk about in detail, right? But yeah, but the point you made is that the Ukrainians can't afford to maintain. They don't have the money. The only way that army is going to be maintained is if the Europeans pay for it, right? And that kind of situation is going to be completely unacceptable to the Russians, right? The Russians want Ukraine to be neutral, a neutral a neutral state. They don't want them to have any kind of relationships with EU, NATO, whatever that begets any kind of dependency between Ukraine and these outside actors. I don't think they're going to accept any policy of that kind. But at the same time, I think the Russians will be prepared to accept that Ukraine should have a reasonable sized armed forces, right, with which to defend itself and to give it, as part of its sense of itself, as an independent sense of security. And by the way, it's not, it's not just Russia that Ukraine might notionally need to defend itself against in the future. There's other countries in the region in which there are various disputes, historical grievances. Yeah, with Poland. Yeah, with Romania. With Hungary. Yeah, it's not unreasonable for a neutral Ukraine to claim that it needs a reasonable sized army with which to defend itself in the future as part of its to be able to defend its neutrality, right? So I don't whether it be what the actual figure will be. I'm not so sure. 600,000 seems a bit high to me. I was a bit surprised by it when I saw that figure. I'd be surprised if the Russians have agreed to 600,000. I think that might be something the Americans have come up with. But certainly, 2, 3, 4, 400,000 troops. That seems to me to be a distinct possibility. A neutral Ukraine will have quite a sizable armed force. Even if it has only 400,000, I think that will still be the biggest army in Europe. I don't think there's any current army in Europe that's bigger than even at 400,000. Okay, so the Russians want neutrality and everything that implies in terms of a significant degree of demilitarization by Ukraine. But on the other hand, the Ukrainians want to have their own defense forces to defend their neutrality and defend their position in the given zone. And I would expect it to be possible to arrive at some kind of compromise as to how that particular part of the peace deal would work out.
You said that Europeans are not that much important when it comes to the deal between the West and Russia, but how about how come the president of the United States so far couldn't achieve anything? We're approaching 1 year of, he
Sure.
talked to Russians in Alaska, as you mentioned, and with the new plan that came out, it's somehow
when I said they're not important, I meant they're not important in relation to the ongoing negotiations in the process. In the process, they've been sidelined
why
in the
is
process.
that? Why is that, Jeff?
Well, because
I
they
think
don't.
that's
No,
the
because
problem.
they don't want peace. They want the war to continue, right? And the Americans want peace. They want a peace process. They want a deal. And the Europeans are obstructive rather than constructive in that process. Okay, but more generally, yeah, the Europeans are important because if it wasn't for the
Jeff,
Europeans,
Jeff,
well,
the United States is not in that region. Europeans are in that region.
I'm just
Europeans
going.
are going to deal with Ukraine.
I'm going to say that, like, if it wasn't for the European position, right? It's the European position that will make the difference as to whether or not Ukraine decides to continue to fight the war. Without European support, Ukrainians would actually have absolutely no support, no choice but to accept whatever deals on. So Europeans are very important in that respect. Europeans are also very important in relation to the whole issue of Russia's frozen central bank assets, yeah, because the majority of them are in Europe, yeah, in Belgium in particular, and part of the plan, this so-called peace plan, the 28 points, is that those assets are going to be unfrozen and returned to Russia, but at the same time, Russia is going to agree to allocate part of those returned assets to the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. Well, okay, but so the Europeans, it's the Europeans who control that the whole question of Russia's central bank assets in Europe. Okay, and then the third reason why the Europeans are important, because of course part of the whole package is that there's going to be a renegotiation of the European security order in relation to both Russia and Ukraine. And Europeans, obviously, it's a European security order. Europeans are going to have to agree to that, to participate. So actually, the Europeans are very, very important going forward. The only thing I'd say is that if there is a deal made and we have some peace, I think that's the point at which the European position will start to crumble. I'd be very. I think then European policy will begin to shift, right? And that we'll get some movement in relation to these issues that I've discussed. But yeah, but actually in an overall sense, in a long term sense, Europe is actually crucial to the whole prospect of arriving at a stable and durable peace in relation to Ukraine and in relation to Europe and in relation to Europe's relations with Russia. So I'm not underestimating the importance of Europe in that sense. I was just saying that I think they don't have much of a voice in the current ongoing negotiations between the Russians, the Americans, and the Ukrainians, because I think that all they have to offer is obstruction, and the Americans are not prepared to put up with that obstruction. And of course, that's another thing that seems to have changed in the American position. Of course, the thing that contributed to the failure of the Alaska summit, in the sense of there being no deal agreed in Alaska, was the role played by the Europeans, right? But it seems that Trump, his administration, seemed to be determined to face down European obstructionist Mr. Trump. So there's okay, the Europeans had their say, but they weren't invited to Florida, right? They haven't been invited to Washington like they were last time. So it seems that Trump and his administration take some quite fundamental decisions that they're going to hold the Europeans at arm's length until they've arrived at this possible deal has materialized. And it's at that point they'll re-engage with the Europeans and bring the Europeans into the peace settlement picture a lot more than they are at the moment.
Do you think that next year, this day, we're gonna talk about the same issues in Ukraine, or we're gonna have something important happening? And how do you see the process of Steve Witkoff? Because whenever Donald Trump talks with European, he sends Marco Rubio to Europe, and then he sends Steve Witkoff to Russia. How do
Yeah.
you see the policies of Donald Trump? Is
Well,
that
it's not so unusual for political leaders to use special envoys to deal with particular issues and problems, rather than working everything through the foreign secretary. So that's not so. Of course, Putin has his special envoys as well, a special representative who've been involved in this process and have been talking to Witkoff about these proposals which have emerged. So it's not that's not such an unusual situation. But yeah, I think it is quite significant that it's that Witkoff has gone to Moscow on his own with Jared Kushner, right? And Rubio is not there. Well, I'm not sure. It may be significant because Witkoff seems to have a much better understanding of and more sympathy for the Russian perspective than Rubio does, and the same seems to apply to Jared Kushner. So it seems to me that if there is a signal, and there may not be any signal in it, but if there is a signal, the signal Trump's putting out when he sends Witkoff and Kushner to Moscow to hammer out the details of the peace plan with Putin, and Rubio doesn't go with them. I think the signal, that's the signal I take from that, if there is a signal, is that Trump is very serious about a peace deal. Yeah, about doing what's necessary to get a deal with the Russians. But so we need to be careful. There's a lot of stuff about Rubio's a neocon at heart, and he doesn't really, he's playing along with it because he has to, because if he doesn't, he would be fired by Trump. But he doesn't really believe in this peace process or this peace deal, that he would much prefer to take a harder line with Russia. I don't know. All those kind of things might be true, but on the other hand, it may be it may be much more complicated behind the scenes. It might be much more complicated picture than people think. I mean, just to suggest, one of the things I've learned as a historian is that what you read in the newspapers or hear in the media is not the same as actually what's happening in private, behind closed doors, in government, and the positions people are taking, and the differences and conflicts that undoubtedly do occur in policy making process are often very different from the way they're interpreted by the media. So it's not clear to me personally that Rubio is a completely negative element in this process. Yeah. He just, maybe he's just a bit more cautious, right, than Witkoff and Kushner. Maybe he's more in tune with domestic politics in the United States and the pressures, because there's still a very, very strong pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia lobby at work in the United States. But we'll see. I mean, again, we'll learn what that story is very soon. If there is an outcome to this process, then it will be very, very clear where Rubio stands in relation to it, as well as where the other participants stand in relation to this possible peace deal.